Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey.
Welcome back to Red Light Exposé. I'm your host, Sabrinna. I am a radical feminist and activist for the Nordic model worldwide. And today I'm being joined by two women who have experienced prostitution in New Zealand. The women are Dottie and Angela. They are not their real names. They are names that we're using to disguise their real identities. Before we start, I want to quickly brief you, our listener, on the 4 legislative models and the minor variations that occur worldwide. There is prohibition, which means that everything is criminal. That is third-party profiteering. So that's somebody who is taking a cut of any exchange of money for access to a person's body. There is living off the earnings, which is also understood as illegal under prohibition, and solicitation. Solicitation means that the person who is offering their body in exchange for money is classed as engaging in an illegal activity. This is the legislation that New Zealand was under prior to 2003. After 2003, the legislation changed and it became full decriminalization. That means that brothels of 5 or more require registration. There are small owner-operated brothels with 4 people or less. Those are called subs. They do not require registration, and there could be, 5 across the country, or there could be 500 across the country. Nobody would know. The police are then unable to enter unless a crime is suspected. And there has been one case in Christchurch of minors being held and prostituted. So that means that they have been raped using the small owner-operated brothels, and that is a problem within the legislation. Outside of New Zealand, there are 2 different types of laws that can be found. One of them is the Nordic model, which was first had in Sweden in 1999, that spread to Norway, Iceland, France, Canada, Northern Ireland, Israel. It is the fastest growing model worldwide, and proponents for this model attribute that to its effectiveness. It's 3-phase and decriminalizes the person selling, criminalizes or makes it illegal to profit off that. It also offers client-led exit and retraining services, plus trauma-informed counseling services at the client's request or at the woman's request. And it makes it illegal for somebody to pay to buy sex off somebody else. The 4th model is understood as legalization, which came into Germany in 2002. Legalization requires every person inside of prostitution to be registered. So that is a problem because that then goes on a woman's permanent record. And when she tries to exit the trade and a background check is done for a job, the employer can see that she has been in prostitution. So today we're talking to women inside New Zealand, and the legislation that we're looking at is full decriminalization and prohibition, not to be mixed with abolition, which is another name for the Nordic model. So after that incredibly long-winded introduction, I'll finally like to introduce you to Dottie and Angela. I'll start with you, Dottie, and ask to give you a brief intro of yourself and when you were in prostitution, please.
Hi. Okay, so I was working in the 90s from sort of 95, 96, just for a couple of years under the prohibition model. And I was working in Nelson and Wellington. In escort agencies, massage parlours. They were the two that I was involved in.
Right, so that would have been under prohibition when it was illegal to work in the sex trade. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Okay, and Angela, hi, how are you? Can you give a brief intro of yourself and when you were in prostitution and what type of prostitution you experienced?
So I'm Angela. I was in prostitution in 2010. I was only 19 at the time, and it was during full legalization. I was in brothels. Yeah, 3 different brothels in Auckland.
Thanks for that. So, what was I'm going to ask both of you the same question. What was your impression of what prostitution was and how it was conducted prior to ever being in it? And I'll start with you, Dottie.
My perception of what it was, I was so naive. I really had no idea of what I was getting myself into. But at the same time, I kind of had an idea that I was going to be allowing stuff to happen to myself that I wasn't really that happy with, but I just needed the money. So that's what I thought I was going to make lots of money. So I didn't really understand the danger involved and just the risk involved, and no safety at all, really. Being dropped off at strangers' places, obviously, being by yourself for quite a long period of time, and having no cell phones back in the 90s. So there was nothing you could do if you got into trouble.
Yeah, when you were dropped off at a man's house, did the agency or the parlor ever ask you to give them a ring and say, "Okay, I've just arrived, I'm safe," or anything like that? Were there any safety protocols that you would undergo?
No. Driver would drop us off, and then he might be going to pick up other women, or sometimes he'd wait, but he'd be sort of down the road. I can't remember him waiting too much. He was usually busy. So we were just given an hour, a time, if that's what was being paid for, or 2 hours, and they'd just pick us up at the end of that time.
And he didn't go in and have a look around to make sure there was only one man there or anything like that?
And no, that was definitely what I would do. But in the times where there was more than one person, I figured it out pretty quickly and didn't go in and was able to leave with the driver. But yeah, a few very close calls, put it that way.
Yeah, okay. So this illusion of safety was just a load of BS for you. And how about you, Angela? What was your impression of the sex trade prior to entering it? And did you experience the same lack of safety that Dottie was just describing?
I remember when decriminalization first came about, so I would have been about 13, and I remember seeing an ad in the newspaper for prostitutes, but it was saying it was a job. It was making it seem normal. It said something like mums and students do it, and it gave like quite a lot of money as an advertisement. So I remember that when I was about 13, I remember seeing that and just being confused about it. And I didn't really think about it too much. But later on, when I was 19 and I ended up in a position where I needed the money, I was unable to work and unable to study and desperately in need of money to pay my rent. And then I saw another ad in the newspaper, which again was saying that mums and students do it, and it made it seem normal. And I took it on as if it was a job. I thought it was a job. So when I went into prostitution, I had the same feelings as if I was going into a job, which was interesting because you don't always want to be at your job, but you turn up anyway. And that was how I ended up going. I didn't really want to be there, but I ended up going anyway. And my manager actually had to convince me every day to go in because I was so not wanting to be there. Yeah, it was very unsafe. I was also dropped off at people's houses and businesses and hotels, and there was no safety measure. I was there by myself. I had to scope it out myself. Driver would just drop me off and pick me up. Sometimes I had to drive myself. And yeah, there was no safety. I was just on my own, and I was a young 19-year-old girl. I was very naive and didn't really know about the dangers, didn't really know about hazards, and it was an experience. It was very unsafe.
Yeah. So, how did you both learn about, what the charges were, how to stay safe, what the dangers were, and particularly in the massage parlor setting or the brothel setting, because girls come in and prior to decriminalization specifically, it was an illegal act. So when girls came in, the other girls, the first thing they thought was, is she an undercover cop? So I'll ask you, Dottie, how did you learn about it and what was it like when you first got into that setting? How did you meet the girls and overcome that obstacle?
It was an escort agency, the first place I worked, and I can't remember any kind of safety talks or anything. It was just very sort of, okay, these are the prices, this is what it is. And, whether it's a in-house call or an out call, it was very, very, this is how it is, less than a minute explained. And, just if you're doing an out call, here's some condoms and, pretty basic. And if it was an in-house, obviously there was stuff in each room. It was very much learning as I went, and then I guess after the jobs, having a drink and kind of debriefing as I got to know some of the other women involved. And I would say it was the end of shift kind of talks where we get to kind of learn about each other and what had been happening. And it just depended who I was working with. The woman who ran the agency was pretty helpful, but at the same time, she was wanting to make money too. So it was pretty sort of, you'll be right, off you go.
Yeah, I do know, sadly. Um, yeah, so Angela, how did you learn about the safety aspects for yourself and what to do in the room? Was there anyone who was helpful at all to you?
Basically, when I first arrived at the brothel, the manager told me what was expected of me. So she said, you have to do a hand job, a blow job, and full on sex inside the room. And the dangers involved, I basically learnt that from the other girls, from discussions that we had in the break room in the staff area, discussions on how not to get murdered. Really, and checking for cameras, if there's more than one man there, what to do, checking under beds, that kind of thing. It was all from the other girls. There was no real discussion from management or anyone else about how to stay safe. It was really just hearsay from the other girls.
In one of the places I once worked, we had spas in the room and loud music, nightclub level music. I remember hearing screams in between the music having pauses in it and running down to the reception desk, getting her to open the door. And there was a man trying to drown one of the women I was working with. Have you ever had anything like that going on in a so-called safe environment? And you don't have to share the story if you don't want to. The point I'm really getting at is we're told, oh, it's safe because you're around other girls. It's safe because you've got a manager and a building that you're all working in together. I guess I'm looking at that myth and if that's held true for you or if it really is just a myth.
Yeah, I mean, when something that feels unsafe is happening at the in-house place, I suppose, honestly, I never ever went and asked for help. I just got on with it and tried to get through it as quickly as I could. The situations where I had danger and other people around me was when I was in a new place in Wellington, and I was too scared to ask for help anyway because the guy running the place was pretty full on. So it was very strict and it was hard to even talk to some of the other women except for very occasionally at the end of the night or when we were getting changed or something. But it was so different, I guess, back in the 90s. not having phones, and I didn't even think about the whole camera thing back then, to be honest. So I was so naive, and I guess that was one of the reasons that I'd get picked a lot, because I had that naivety about me, even though I was in my 20s, made me popular, so to speak.
Yeah, that's such a common thing that I've heard, that the men always go for the youngest girl possible and the newest girl possible. And it sounds like that's what you were subject to as well.
Yeah. And just, I don't know, something about me. Bit nerdy, bit naive, So looked very inexperienced, I guess.
Angela, did you have any of that kind of thing where you were told, oh, yeah, this is the safe way of doing it, you wouldn't want to be on your own, and evidence to the contrary while there?
Yeah, so in one of the brothels I was working in, I don't actually call it work, I call it being prostituted, because I don't believe it's work, it's not a job, it's being abused. On a side note, anyway.
Fair enough. I actually agree with you on that.
So one of the brothels that I was in, being prostituted out of, there was another girl there who, a Korean man came in one night and he was on drugs, and he asked her to pretend to be dead, and then he tried to strangle her, and the police were not called until quite a bit later because the girl wanted to call the police and the manager of the brothel didn't want the police to be called because they said it was bad for business. So there was a lot of screaming going on, a lot of yelling, and then eventually the police turned up. But that was really the last night I was at that place, and then I tried to leave prostitution and ended up going back later on, but that was scary for me. It was, not safe. And that was out of a brothel where there were other women there. Yeah, it's definitely not safe. There's been a couple of times as well where there's been people on drugs and violent men who come into the brothel, because I've only worked in brothels. You just can't really tell.
Yeah, and brothels in New Zealand do outcalls as well. You did outcalls, yes?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Yeah. So for our audience, an in-call is where the man goes into the brothel, and an out-call is where the woman is sent like pizza as a delivery service to where the man is residing, whether that be his home, a hotel, a motel, or in some cases, it can be an outdoor area. There are brothels that will send women to men in outdoor areas. No, that sounded really, really creepy, this guy wanting to have her pretend she was dead. But it's not the first time I've heard someone say the police weren't called because it's bad for business. In fact, I've been in places that the exact same thing. We don't call the police because it'll scare off our clients. And the language used in New Zealand is client for our listeners. Though for us, it's more of an abuser who doesn't think he's an abuser. Would that be a fair statement, Angela?
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that statement.
And Dottie, what do you call these guys? How do you understand the men who paid?
We just called them punters back when I was prostituted. And I did remember actually an outcall I did that was pretty horrendous, because it was kind of a bikie pad, and I didn't know where I was going because I was driving myself because we were short of drivers, and it was kind of a bit in the country. And I had to turn my car around very quickly because I could see what was happening. And I had 3 bikes chase me for a while down the road. I just remembered that when Angela was talking. So that was an interesting night. I must have probably drunk quite a lot when I got back to the escort in-house. And a few other outcalls actually where it was clear there was more than one person and there was no way I was even going to knock at the door. So I had one of them happen in Wellington and I didn't know where I was, and my driver had left, so I was just walking down the street hoping he was going to come back, and that was it was probably only about 20 minutes, but pretty scary. And just that feeling of fear, I must say, was kind of ever present. It became this kind of sense of doom or dread because I couldn't really get away from it, because that feeling was always there, like right from the beginning of the night. And like I relate to Angela saying not wanting to go to work, that feeling's there all the time, but you just have to kind of press it down and go.
I know what you're talking about. It's like an ever-present fear that you get so used to having that it becomes your normal.
Yeah, and just that hypervigilance. I mean, it's like being what I would say now of being in a really dangerous relationship, that constant feeling of walking on eggshells. And you've got that feeling with every kind of encounter that you're about to have. And all the way through, because it's unpredictable. It's completely unpredictable. And you've got absolutely, bugger all control apart from the gift of the gab and your body. So you become pretty good at kind of sussing guys out. But at the same time, there's also a real surrender to the very, very present risk.
And there's this myth out there that you can turn down clients. I'm using the term client because this is the way that it's said. So, did you ever get to turn down a punter? And how did you go about that without endangering yourself?
No, I don't recall that ever happening. Certainly not in-house. The only out calls that I would have turned down were the ones effectively where there were multiple men present, so I didn't go there. No, I've never been able to turn down a client punter.
Angela, how about you? Have you ever been able to turn down one of the men that you were meant to surface?
At the last brothel I was in, there were some unsavory sort of people. Not unsavory, but more like dirty and old sort of men who no one really wanted to be with. The brothel owner did tell me it's okay if you want to turn them down, and so I did. So that was quite good. That only happened 1 or 2 times. Other times I was sort of expected to sort of go with everybody.
Yeah, were there any kind of negative consequences for doing that? Were you still sold, and this is a horrible way of putting it, but were you still sold over the phone for outcalls or for men ringing to inquire who was on that night? Or were you plugged less as a result?
I don't remember anything negative happening afterwards. I do remember though so the very last place I went to, I didn't actually work there, but I went there and I was about to try and start work there, and I was sort of having a panic attack and couldn't go in with anybody, and the lady behind the desk told me, well, if you don't go in with anybody now, then you're never going to come back. So that was the end of that really, because I didn't go in. So that was the last time I was ever in prostitution, was that brothel.
Yeah, because the reason I asked is because, like, some places, if you turn down a guy, because I worked under full decriminalization as well as prior to full decrim, some places, if you turn a man down, they will accept it, but then the consequence for doing so was that she wouldn't promote you or sell you over the phone. And so that was a deterrent. And so it's good that in that one place they did actually respect your right to say no. And I'm sorry to hear about having what sounds like an anxiety attack or a panic attack at, the very last one. And I've seen women go through that.
We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
Another myth is of the happy hooker. She's the one who says, I choose sex work, and she uses that term sex work and says, I absolutely love what I do, and everybody I work with loves what they do. What was your impression of the women you worked with their attitudes, the way they approached it, the things that they would say to men compared to the things they'd say about them? And I'll go back to you, Dottie.
Look, to be honest, the entire time I was working, there was a lot of drug use, and it was almost like getting your game face on to go into it, because you had to be reasonably numb because it's such a painful experience, physically, mentally, emotionally. Oh, God, thank fuck that's over when we'd all, see each other after clients, punters. But it would be definitely just a mask, playing a role to try and sort of survive each encounter, really, each rape. And often, by the end of the night, I'd had quite a few drinks in between clients, different pills, and I was usually very, very numb by the end of the night. One place in Wellington where I worked, they didn't pay on the night that we worked. Me and a friend had come up from Nelson and we were staying at the owner's house, and he transported us to the brothel, and we didn't get paid for 4 nights, so we were basically trapped and couldn't go anywhere. There were fines for different things, like to do with towels and sheets, and we had to kind of get everything in the wash after clients and get the room ready for the next client ourselves. And because this was the first time I'd ever really experienced it being that full on, I was not fast enough. So it was like a combination of speed hotel cleaning at the same time while your body's recovering from what you've just been through.
I remember, yeah, we had the same thing of being fined for being a minute late out of the room, or if the guy complained for any reason, if you didn't leave the room absolutely perfectly spotless. Yeah, there was a lot of reasons that they were trying dip their hands in and get as much of that money as possible. And withholding for 24 hours was a good way for them to make up charges. So, Angela, did you have similar things going on? What was the attitude of the women you worked with and, in front of a client behind their back?
The attitude is very different in front of a client compared to behind their back. So, in front of a client, girls would try and be pleasant and smile and all those things because you need to make a sale, really. Behind their back, there was a lot of gossip, a lot of disgust. The girls would often be disgusted by the men and talk about how horrible they were and talk about what happened in the room, talk about just general disgust at certain people, especially the ones that were kind of grimy or dirty or old or just creepy. Yeah, there was a lot of talk about, especially like repeat clients, talking about if they were pleasant or if they were horrible. I think it was quite valuable actually, the talking that happened behind the scenes, because it helped us to look after ourselves really inside the room and make decisions on who we went in with and who we didn't.
Yeah, actually, I remember that also. The regulars to a brothel that would see multiple girls, and the girls would be like, "Oh, that dude," and it'd be like nickname Humpback or something like that. And there'd be some put down of a nickname, and they would then warn each other, "Oh, he gets into this kind of thing. Be careful of this. This is where he'll try and slip a condom off," or something like that. Did you have things like that as well? Is that the kind of talk that you had with the girls?
Yeah, definitely. It was, yeah, kind of warnings about their behavior and just learning all kinds of aspects of the regulars. Yeah, we definitely had those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, so the myth of the happy hooker. I've met one person throughout the time that I was working, through all the people who walked through that place and the multiple places. I met one who was actually a happy hooker. Have either of you ever met a real life happy hooker who's just like, this is who I am and what I do? And I'll start with you, Dottie.
I've met some pretty amazing women, actually, extraordinary women who were surviving all kinds of things outside of the role and inside, the prostitution. But I must say, the only happiness I saw was drug and alcohol induced. So, and probably, like Angela said, the talking was supportive and there was some really strong connections. So that was in relation to each other. It wasn't the job. Yeah, no, I never met anyone who liked what they were doing. No, it was really just about the money, because familiar with being abused. And that was probably a big standout thing to me. Every single woman I worked with had experienced childhood or teenage sexual abuse. And it was very much a, oh, well, might as well get paid for it attitude amongst us all,
Yeah. Angela, can you relate to that as well?
Definitely. Most of the women there were pretty miserable. They didn't want to be there. They were there out of necessity rather than being happy. I only met one person once who was actually proud of what she was doing, or seemed proud on the surface, but she had a lot of issues herself, like she was into drug use, and she just seemed like someone who had a lot of mental health issues, and her husband was actually pimping her. So I wouldn't really even class her as happy, even though on the surface she seemed to be proud of what she was doing. There was a lot of childhood abuse in the backgrounds of all the girls, a lot of trauma. I remember one girl ended up in there because she couldn't survive after her husband had died. He'd been decapitated in a car crash, and she'd witnessed it, and she was just experiencing a lot of trauma, and she couldn't survive financially, so she ended up in there. But yeah, there was a lot of trauma in the backgrounds of everybody. The only happiness here would have been the bonding between the girls. Like, we had shared food together sometimes and shared cigarettes. And I wouldn't really even call that happiness. It was friendliness and companionship in a miserable place, but still having friendship and companionship.
And I think it is women's testament that no matter what environment we find ourselves in, we do find ways of coping and creativity and bonding with each other. It seems to happen under some severe circumstances. One of the other myths that goes on is that only current so-called sex workers, women in prostitution, are qualified to comment on prostitution. In your view, who's allowed to talk? Whose opinion matters? And again, I'll start with you, Dottie.
I guess anyone who's experienced prostitution and been involved, sorry, not anyone, women, the survivors. I think the women who have been prostituted, yeah, people who have. I don't think that pimps or punters have a place to comment. I mean, they're going to have their perspective, of course, but in terms of understanding the reality of the experience, they can't possibly.
Yeah, I agree with you. So many times you see punters saying, "Oh, all the girls I saw really loved it." And it's like, yeah, they all acted really well, and you were the idiot who believed them. You know? Yeah, so Angela, who do you think has the right to speak about prostitution and whose opinion actually matters? Would you agree with the pro lobby when they say only women in it are allowed to talk about it?
Yeah, I think survivors, women who have come out of it, have a voice that needs to be listened to. Sometimes the women who are still in it, their opinions come out quite pro prostitution because they're still there out of necessity and it's something that they're relying on. And they're still in, it's sort of like Stockholm syndrome, like they still need it as a method of surviving so that they'll be pro for it. I think they still need to have a voice, but it's tricky because they won't talk about the harms so much because they have a reason to look over those things. But yeah, definitely survivors need to have a voice, especially once they've come out and healed from the trauma. I think definitely pimps and punters or clients shouldn't be taken seriously because they have a perspective that everything is fine because of the image that they see, which is being presented to them, which is not true. Yeah, and also they are coming from a position where they're using the girl, they have an interest in making things seem okay when it's really not okay.
Yeah, the pro lobby, this is the people who have said they're for full decriminalisation and want to maintain full decriminalisation in New Zealand. They have always said that they're speaking on behalf of the women in the sex trade and that they've spoken to women in the sex trade to form the opinions that they've formed, and that this is what women want. Women want full decriminalisation. Has this been something that you've thought about? And if so, what are your thoughts on the matter? Or has the legislation actually really just not been an issue for you? I'll start with you, Dottie.
I guess at the time I was working, because it was prohibition, I didn't really have much understanding at all, except that we didn't want anything to do with police, obviously. I can't remember much political stuff back then. It just wasn't in the landscape I was navigating. So in terms of what I know after full decrim, and since I have been involved as a support worker with different women's agencies and working with exited women who have been prostituted or women who are still involved, they definitely don't see a difference since the law changed. It's still dangerous. They're still facing the same issues. If anything, the police are less involved and they find it harder to go to the police if there are violence or stuff that they want to report. So they actually find it harder now. That's been what I've been told.
Yeah, well, the police don't have any right to go in and for any reason unless they are following up on a complaint made. So it does make it incredibly difficult for them. Their hands are pretty much tied. So nobody actually came in and said, do you want full decriminalisation? This is what it is. You never had anybody asking you.
No, I didn't know anything about that. As I said, I was just in that survival mode. So it wasn't as if I didn't even know about the Prostitutes Collective. I didn't know anything. It was just a survival, really, and very much a lot of coercive control and a lot of kind of gaslighting and just all that conditioning that I guess I was under.
Yeah, that's actually quite telling that you didn't even know about the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective. For our listeners, the NZPC is the pro-lobby in New Zealand that helped bring in full decriminalisation and defends full decriminalisation as, in their opinion, the best model for the world, not just for New Zealand. So I'll ask you, Angela, did you know anything about the NZPC, about full decriminalisation, what it meant? Did anybody ever ask for your opinion? And do you have any opinion on what legislation would help women in prostitution?
I came in when full decriminalisation was happening, and really it just meant that brothels could advertise jobs, and it kind of tricked me. Because it was full decriminalisation, it kind of tricked me into believing that what was happening to me was a job and that it was a job like any other job. I didn't really think about the legislation. I was just experiencing what I was experiencing. I did get offered to register as a prostitute with the Prostitutes Collective, but obviously I chose not to because you don't want your name as a prostitute and you don't want to pay taxes, really. So that's why I chose not to. There was a notice board, and up on the notice board they were advertising they were testing for HIV. So that was one positive thing. But yeah, other than that, there was no real relationship with NZPC. I didn't really seek it out as well, to be honest. I didn't really know that kind of help that they might offer. I didn't think about the legislation until afterwards. After I got out, I was kind of angry at how could I ever be sort of vulnerable enough to get tricked into believing it was a job. I was angry at the legislation, at it being legal. I've believed that if it wasn't legal, I probably wouldn't have gone into it because I didn't do anything illegal at the time. I was going in there because I thought it was a job. So yeah, so that kind of changed my opinion on it. Yeah, I became quite pro the Nordic model or even prohibition. I just thought anything that didn't have prostitution was good. I was just upset that I ever ended up in that situation in the first place.
Yeah, some of the things they say is sex work is real work, blowjobs are real jobs, it's a job like any other. And what, in your opinion, makes it not a job like any other and maybe not even a job?
It's a violation of a woman's body. So in any other job, you would be protected from sexual abuse and protected from sexual harassment and degradation and that kind of thing. You have workplace safety protocols, whereas in prostitution, there's none of that because your whole job is to be sexually abused, basically. And the whole job is to be violated. It doesn't matter if you want it or you don't want it because at the end of the day, you're there because you need the money and you're in a vulnerable position, so you're actually being exploited. which means it's not a job because no other job requires you to have sexual violation, really, that physical violation of your body.
Yeah, I agree with you. Dottie, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I totally agree. That's exactly right. Don't think I could have said it better myself. It is just getting paid to be abused, and there's no consent. There's no other work where that occurs. So it's impossible to put any kind of health and safety policies into place because it's impossible with the nature of what the experience is.
Yeah, I find it absolutely laughable, the idea of occupational safety and health inside a brothel. Because, like, if you're selling a mattress, you have to get it steam cleaned and show the date and time that it was done and which company, all of this. Yet you've got people jumping on and off beds and just throwing some towels down. And, even just basics like that before you even get into the physical violation side of it. Even that doesn't come up to the most rudimentary standards for outside of the sex trade. And as a friend of mine, Rachel Moran, who wrote Paid For, has said, if a woman put a sign on her saying, "You can punch me for money," people would be absolutely screaming, "That's not okay. You can't consent to that." Yet when a woman says, "You can use my body for money," people go, "Oh, no, that's consent." I say, okay, no, money is not consent. So I'm really glad to talk to two other people who perceive this in the same way. But what also stands out to me so much is that even though there's this time gap between the 1990s and the 2010s, the experience is so similar despite the legislation change. So the equality model, one of the things that they say about it, those who oppose it, is that it denies women agency. So I'll start with you this time, Angela. What do you think of this idea that the equality model denies women's agency in the sex trade?
I think it's based on the assumption that it's a woman's choice, and in reality, it's very, very few women who really actually choose prostitution out of a position of wealth or abundance, really. Most women end up there because they're being exploited because of poverty or hard financial situations or drug abuse or sexual abuse in their past. There's always a vulnerability factor that really plays into becoming a prostitute in most cases. So women don't have agency, like in the first place. They've got all these external factors which are pushing them into prostitution, and their agency has been stripped away before they even start this prostitution. So it's about protecting those girls who are vulnerable, really. This is what the Nordic model is all about, protecting the girls who are vulnerable. Whereas decriminalization tries to protect the rights of those who make a free will choice, which is very, very, very seldom. So it's very unbalanced, that kind of idea.
Yeah, so it's decriminalization centers the 1%, while the Nordic model centers the 99%.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, Dottie, do you have anything that you could add to this idea that, that it's taking away women's agency or it's pushing it underground is another one that they often say about the Nordic model?
No, I would just reiterate that, the whole thing of women having agency is actually, if you look at consent law, it's all about autonomy, and without autonomy, you can't consent. And I think that autonomy is completely taken away just by the nature of being a prostitute. And also, the drivers of that so-called choice. I mean, how can you make a choice when your options are so incredibly limited? It's not really a free choice, is it?
No, it's coercion, whether that be just by being in society or whether that be in the actual places themselves.
Yes, I think it's oppression, and it's an oppressive choice to make because of the inequity that certain women are experiencing, and it is only some women. that choose to go into prostitution. Choose, I say that with quotation marks, because, all these so-called pro-lobby who talk about it being, pro-choice and it's great and everything, well, they're not choosing to do it, so why not? It's only women who have experienced so much oppression in their life that this is just another form of oppression, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's really telling. It's not married women who are in the top 1% of wealth who are just so happening to choose it. It's women who are homeless, women who are drug addicted, alcohol addicted, women who are young and starting out in life, and women who are impoverished for whatever reason.
Yeah, that's right. And it's, any kind of transaction, sometimes it's not even for money, if someone's homeless, they prostitute themselves just to, get somewhere to sleep.
Yeah, I've seen advertising of men saying, oh, you don't have to pay to stay in the room. You'd be sharing a bed with a 40-year-old male. And we all know what they're talking about.
It's just unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah. And the full decriminalization is what enables those ads to be so brazen about what it is they're advertising.
That's right, yeah.
One of the other things that we're always accused of from this side of the fence is conflating prostitution and trafficking. So, conflating coming into prostitution by choice compared to somebody being forced into it by one method or another. And for myself, I remember seeing women who were living inside the brothel. They were of Asian descent. I think they were Thai and Vietnamese from memory. They could barely speak English, and I never saw them even go and get lunch. And at the time, I didn't know that they were trafficked. But now looking back, I'm like, it is very highly possible that I was working with women who had been trafficked. Have either of you experienced anything like that, or did you notice anything at the time, or is there anything that you look back on and go, oh my goodness, that's a red flag right there? I'll start with you, Angela.
I remember in one of the brothels there was a girl who was definitely underage. The brothel owners didn't take any form of ID or anything from anyone, so I don't know if they knew that she was underage or not. But I think under the worldwide definitions of trafficking, if you're underage and in prostitution, you're automatically being sex trafficked and someone profiting off your abuse. So there was that example. And then there was also a girl who came in and who was trying to recruit people overseas. I remember that, which is another vulnerability to being trafficked. Those are the two examples that I remember. I didn't really realize that I had been trafficked myself, but under the worldwide definitions, if you're coming from a place of vulnerability, then that's counted as trafficking. So yeah.
Okay, I've never applied that term to myself. What was it like for you facing that word? Because there's a lot of stigma attached to that word.
I actually found it a lot easier when I was describing what happened to me to other people. I found it a lot easier using the word trafficking because I identified more with that than I did prostitution. Now I use them both interchangeably, but my experience of being there without wanting to be there, being basically coerced every day by my manager to come in, like you're coerced into being sold to different people you don't want to have sexual relationships with. So I definitely feel like the word just makes it easier to explain to people my experience. But then it doesn't always describe the complete nature because people have a different idea of what I'm talking about. So sometimes they think it means being held in a captive and it would chained up or something. Whereas actually I was in a very desperate place of vulnerability, but it still counts as trafficking in the overseas definition.
Yeah, so by the New Zealand understanding, it's entering by choice, but by the UN's definition of trafficking, it meets that. I do understand in New Zealand, we just don't say that anyone has been trafficked.
There's actually quite a high proportion of people who are being trafficked in New Zealand. It's just not recognised as trafficking.
Yeah, it's been really recent that actually labour trafficking has been acknowledged in New Zealand, and I think that's the only form of trafficking that has been officially acknowledged as existing from inside New Zealand borders. But America and the UN have both recognised New Zealand as both a destination point and originating point of trafficking. So, Dottie, the original question that I was asking was if you saw any signs of trafficking while you were in it, or anything that would lead you to believe that now.
Well, thinking back, there were definitely some underage girls when I was in Wellington. I have only just realised recently that the short week that I spent in Wellington being driven between the owner's house and the brothel with my friend, and the fact that we weren't paid for 4 days, that actually that was trafficking, because we actually couldn't leave. There was nothing we could do. There wasn't even a phone we could use. We didn't get to do anything. We couldn't even walk down the road to a dairy because we were out in some industrial area. We didn't really know where we were. So I didn't have any idea that that was trafficking until, like I say, just recently. You know, it's a confronting reality. But it was so easily done as well. And I was, and my friend, we didn't try to get away. We couldn't, because we just wanted our money. So we just kind of looked after each other and did what we had to do to get through. And we just were so compliant and so traumatized, I suppose, at the time, that we couldn't do anything else other than comply so that we survived. Both of us did have injuries, and that was also part of the kind of that freeze, numbness, unable to do anything.
Yeah, and you're taught as kids to comply with what teachers tell you, what parents tell you. These are the rules. You go here, you don't go there. And so when you're that young and you're coming from an injured space and an emotionally hurt space, it is easier to do what you're told than it is to fight, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I guess because it was illegal, the prohibition when I was there in the 90s, we just didn't consider calling the police. It just was just not even anywhere in our minds. We were just like, we just got to make it to get our money, and then we can get a taxi, you know?
Oh, of course. You're not going to ring the police if you think that they're going to arrest you and charge you and that you'll end up in jail. And this is what current trafficking victims who have recently come out of it have actually said as well, that they'd never even crossed their mind to ask anybody for help.
That's right. And I don't think that Decrim has improved that, because it's the nature of the power dynamic in trafficking, and understanding that really common trauma response of freezing and complying and fawning so that you survive, which is, what you do in an abusive relationship. And it's only when you leave that situation that you're able to kind of look back eventually and see it for what it was, because I certainly had no understanding or analysis of what I was going through at the time.
For our listeners, the Prostitution Reform Act 2003 has Section 19, and what that has one line, and it prevents women from being allowed to work in brothels, escort agencies, or anywhere inside of the sex trade who are not a New Zealander or an Australian. Those are the only two people who are allowed to work under decriminalisation. If that one line gets removed, which is what the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective is trying to have done at the moment, it would mean that women coming in from overseas would be under decriminalisation, which effectively decriminalises trafficking. I just felt the need to put that in there while we were talking about this. But I only got a couple more questions for you both. One of them was, did you need help in leaving prostitution, in getting into another area? And did you receive any help? And I'll start with you, Angela, because we haven't heard from you for a little while.
Yeah, so I definitely needed help. I was mentally very traumatized and I ended up very suicidal. The reason I went into prostitution was because I couldn't work and I couldn't study. And Work and Income had decided they wouldn't pay me because they believed it was my fault I left my job. In the reality, I'd actually had a mental breakdown, and that was why my job had ended. So I got out by going on the student allowance and trying to study again. So I decided to do boat building, of all things, and failed at that. I had another mental breakdown and couldn't study. I was having extreme PTSD episodes. I ended up with PTSD quite bad. So I tried studying, couldn't do that, tried working again, and couldn't do that. I couldn't face people. Everyone was giving me extreme anxiety, and just life in general was giving me extreme anxiety, and I was having breakdowns all the time. So I ended up quite suicidal because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to survive life really and not go into prostitution, but I also knew I couldn't go back into prostitution because I knew I'd end up dead. So I ended up actually trying to commit suicide, and my boyfriend at the time took me to the doctor, who referred me to the crisis team, who sent me to the hospital, and I got diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. They also call it complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I didn't tell them that I'd just come out of prostitution. That was the main cause of my PTSD. And then I ended up in counselling for 2 years because of that. When I told my counsellor that I had been in prostitution, she said to me, I heard it wasn't that bad, and that really set me off, as in I felt like I couldn't talk to her anymore because I felt like she didn't understand what I was talking about. There was no help really. There was absolutely nothing. I had to leave. I left just one night. I just didn't go back to the brothel. And there was no exit service or anything. Work and Income didn't help. Even the fact that I had PTSD, no one really helped me until I ended up suicidal, and that was the only help that I got, was when I tried to commit suicide. They actually listened and tried to help me then. Other than that, there was nothing. And I still haven't heard of anything available to women who are exiting in the current situation. There's not really any exit services or anything trying to help women to get out.
I'm really sorry to hear that you went through that. For our listeners, Work and Income New Zealand is a payment that is made when somebody is unemployed. It's the dole, or the unemployment benefit, is available, and sickness benefit, and that's meant to be available when people are without work and unable to work for whatever reason. And for our listeners, if there is anybody who is in need of counselling services for prostitution, there is in Australia HerSpace, HERSPACE, and they can be found online. And I believe that they would be able to help somebody in New Zealand as well via phone call or online. Yeah, thank you for that, Angela. I'm really, really sorry it was that hard. Dottie, did you have anyone help you? Did you need help to get out? And if you didn't, what would have helped?
There was definitely no help to get out. I just simply had to change my circumstances. I just moved away from where I was. I got into a relationship and became pregnant, and that was pretty much the change of circumstance for me that helped me move away from that work. Yeah, it was kind of off again, on again, probably for 6 or 7 months while I was trying to leave, because I was really broke. So it was easy to go, okay, I'll just do one more, or I'll just do next weekend, or, and that went on for quite some time. I had complex PTSD diagnosis too. I was actually seeing a counsellor at the time I was trying to leave. And yeah, when I look back, it wasn't that she was supportive of the industry. She was supportive of me and certainly never judged me. But she never ever sort of said to me, this sounds really horrible for you and this is really unsafe. Do you want some help? She never offered any help. So I kind of thought she was a good counsellor because I didn't feel ashamed to be able to talk about the experiences I was having. So it was kind of somewhere for me to offload, I guess. But no, there was definitely no kind of agency support or anywhere to exit. And from what I've found today with some women that I've worked with or over the last decade, it's the same for them too, unless they're lucky enough to meet a counsellor who is trauma informed and has a feminist analysis and understanding of the sex trade.
Is that easy to find, or is I would imagine it's incredibly difficult to find a trauma-informed feminist analysis counsellor?
Well, yeah, I think it is hard to find, but I think it's vital to support women exiting in New Zealand, definitely. So I think there's more talk of it around some of the circles I keep, but I think it's still very, very difficult to access.
Looking back, what would have helped you the most to either not enter or to exit, or actually both?
I think if I hadn't been sexually abused as a child and raped in my teenage years, I would not have considered it. And exiting it, if I'd had a counsellor, label it as the abuse it was. I mean, I knew it at a deep, deep level, obviously, because it was so traumatising, but I just didn't have the language for it, and I didn't really understand, because I thought it was all my choice. And so there was just all that internalised shame, that it was my choice and I was in control of it. So
if someone had actually said to you, this is not your fault, this is something that, you're gritting and bearing and you don't have to, let's explore other ways, would that have been helpful?
absolutely. I think psychoeducation and understanding and actually an analysis of abuse and sexual violence is incredibly important for women in general, but for women in prostitution even more so. Because of the age that most of the women are, there's just been not enough kind of self-reflection or support to even understand what's happening. It's really just pure survival, and there's not a lot of capacity to even look at anything else because you're just trying to cope.
Yeah. So, Angela, when you look back, what would have helped you not enter and what would have helped you exit?
I think helping me not enter would have been if it was illegal, definitely. I would have never gone in if I knew that it was dangerous or illegal. Helping me to exit, also not to enter, like just having support, like from work and income or having some assistance with, because so basically I ended up in that situation because I was going through a lot of trauma. My parents had just both passed away quite suddenly and a year apart from each other. My dad committed suicide. I was experiencing that trauma, and then I couldn't work or study, and then work and income wouldn't pay me, and it was just a bad cycle of events. So having some kind of intervention from someone to do with the trauma and just the support from work and income or somebody to help me survive without having to turn to prostitution.
And it seems so obvious that having financial support and psychological support when, life impacts you in a negative way suddenly and in such an extreme way, it's just so obvious that this is what we need as a society.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, having some kind of support in that respect would have helped me not enter. Helping me to exit would have been, well, I think someone reaching out to me while I was still in prostitution with support services, like just knowing about how to get out if I needed that escape would have been good. I needed help with my rent. I needed somewhere to live. I couldn't work or study, so I needed somewhere that I could actually live, like a refuge. I needed counselling. I needed lots of counselling. Yeah, I needed that kind of help and didn't receive it, unfortunately. But yeah, having a safe space, I think having a safe house would be good. Having a phone line where you can call and talk to someone about what you're going through. Having a mentor, someone who had been through the situation and was coming out of it and recovering. That would have been good.
Yeah, and this just goes to show that this idea that it's a victimless crime is just so wrong. For the audience listening, we've got two guests who've talked about CPTSD and trauma, and this is the most common thing that we hear from women world over, no matter what the legislation is. I just want to thank you both for talking so openly and honestly about this and just giving, our listeners the opportunity to hear it, what it really is, rather than the fake accounts on X and things like that. So, Dottie, thank you very much. And Angela, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.